The death of Brooke did not arrive as a single moment, but as a fracture that split the world of those who loved her into a before and an after. One moment, she was a presence so constant that it felt permanent, woven into the rhythm of family, ambition, and identity. The next, she was reduced to a headline, a police report, and a silence so vast it swallowed every certainty that had once defined the Logan name. The car accident that took her life was described by authorities as catastrophic, violent, and instantaneous. Yet for Ridge, nothing about it felt final. Grief did not come to him as a clean break, but as a looping disbelief, a refusal of the mind to accept what the heart was being forced to endure. Brooke had survived betrayals, scandals, and wars both personal and professional. The idea that she could be erased by twisted metal and shattered glass felt not just cruel, but wrong. Ridge's pain was raw, unfiltered, and destabilizing. He moved through the days following the accident like a man suspended between waking and dreaming, replaying memories in obsessive detail, searching for signs he might have missed, words he might have misunderstood, moments he might have taken for granted. The house felt hollow without her, every familiar space echoing with the absence of her presence. He clung to denial not because he lacked intelligence or courage, but because acceptance would mean acknowledging that the one constant he had always returned to was gone forever. His grief manifested as anger at the randomness of fate, at the cruelty of chance, and eventually at the world itself for daring to continue when Brooke could not. Hope experienced her mother's death differently, though no less painfully. Where Ridge was consumed by sorrow, Hope was consumed by questions. Her grief was sharp, focused, and restless, refusing to settle into passive mourning. Brooke had raised her to observe, to think critically, to trust instinct without surrendering to emotion. And those lessons now surfaced with relentless clarity. The official explanation of the accident, though delivered with solemn authority, failed to satisfy her. It felt incomplete, too convenient, as though it had been assembled quickly to close a door rather than open an investigation. Hope could not shake the feeling that something about her mother's final hours remained unspoken, hidden beneath layers of assumption and institutional efficiency. That unease crystallized into suspicion the moment Hope began sorting through Brooke's belongings. What started as a ritual of remembrance quickly transformed into a moment of discovery that altered the trajectory of her grief. Inside her mother's handbag, tucked away with the kind of care reserved for items not meant to be forgotten, Hope found a small note. It was unremarkable in size, easily overlooked, but the contents were anything but insignificant. A strange symbol was scribbled hastily at the top, unfamiliar yet deliberate, as though it carried meaning beyond its simple shape. Beneath it was a phone number, unmistakably circled with emphasis. Hope recognized it immediately. It belonged to Bill Spencer. The discovery sent a jolt through her, not as a conclusion but as a provocation. Brooke had known Bill for years. Their lives intertwined through business, family, rivalry, and uneasy alliances. Yet the intimacy implied by the note unsettled Hope. Why would her mother carry Bill's number separately, marked so distinctly, instead of relying on the convenience of a phone contact? Why the symbol, and why the urgency suggested by the circled digits? The note felt less like a reminder and more like a warning. A fragment of a conversation interrupted by fate. In that moment, grief and suspicion fused into a single driving force, and Hope understood that mourning her mother might require uncovering truths others would prefer remain buried. As Hope wrestled with the implications of the note, the police investigation began to shift in tone. What had initially been described as a tragic accident took on a more ominous dimension when forensic analysis revealed irregularities in Brooke's vehicle. The brakes, investigators concluded, showed signs of deliberate interference. This was not a mechanical failure, nor the result of wear and tear, but an act carried out with intention and precision. The revelation reframed everything. Brooke had not simply lost control, control had been taken from her. The road that claimed her life had not been an unfortunate coincidence, but the final stage of a calculated sequence of events. The implications were staggering. Someone had wanted Brooke silenced, removed, eliminated. The question was not whether her death was intentional, but why, and by whom. For Ridge, the news shattered what little stability he had managed to construct in the wake of her loss. Grief gave way to rage, disbelief morphing into a consuming need for justice. He could not reconcile the woman he loved with the idea that she had been targeted, hunted in a manner more befitting a crime thriller than a life rooted in fashion, family, and legacy. The thought that Brooke had driven her final miles unaware of the danger beneath her feet haunted him relentlessly. Hope, however, began to see patterns where others saw chaos. Her mind returned again and again to the note, to Bill's number, to the symbol she could not yet decode. She considered the timing of Brooke's death, the context in which it occurred, and the broader conflicts simmering beneath the surface of the Logan world. The fashion empire bearing their name was no longer a unified front. Tensions between Brooke and Katie had intensified in recent months, their disagreements evolving from creative differences into something more territorial and personal. The Logan brand had become a battlefield, and Brooke, with her authority and influence, stood as both gatekeeper and obstacle. In that light, Hope began to question motives rather than emotions. Bill Spencer was not merely a businessman with a complicated history. He was a strategist, a man known for playing the long game, for moving pieces quietly until outcomes appeared inevitable rather than orchestrated. His relationship with Katie, his history with Brooke, and his deep involvement in the fashion industry placed him squarely at the intersection of opportunity and incentive. The idea that Brooke's removal could clear the path for Katie in the ongoing power struggle was not merely cynical speculation, it was a theory grounded in understanding how power operates when sentiment becomes inconvenient. Hope did not accuse lightly. She understood the weight of suspicion, the damage it could cause, and the danger of allowing grief to distort judgment. Yet she could not ignore the convergence of evidence. A deliberately sabotaged vehicle, a hidden note linking her mother to Bill, a looming battle over legacy and control. Each element alone might be explained away, but together they formed a constellation too precise to dismiss. The question that haunted her was not whether Bill had the capacity for such an act, but whether he believed it to be necessary. Ridge struggled with Hope's suspicions, torn between his loyalty to Brooke's memory and his reluctance to accept that someone they knew, someone who had once been entangled in their lives so deeply, could be capable of orchestrating her death. His pain made him vulnerable, his longing for certainty battling against the instinct to protect the past from being tainted by betrayal. Yet as details continued to emerge, even his resistance began to weaken. The notion that Brooke's death had been preventable, that it had been engineered rather than accidental, demanded accountability, regardless of how uncomfortable the truth might be. Hope, meanwhile, embraced the role of investigator not out of ambition but out of obligation. She owed her mother more than tears and memorials, she owed her truth. Every memory of Brooke's strength, resilience, and refusal to be sidelined fueled her determination. Brooke had never been passive in life, and Hope refused to allow her death to be reduced to a footnote or a convenient narrative. She began quietly tracing connections, revisiting conversations, examining timelines, and questioning assumptions. Each step brought her closer to an unsettling realization that Brooke may have known she was in danger, that the note in her handbag was not a coincidence but a contingency. The symbol on the paper remained a mystery, but Hope suspected it was a marker, a signifier of something only Brooke and its intended recipient would understand. It suggested urgency, secrecy, and perhaps even fear. The idea that her mother might have been preparing for confrontation, or documenting a threat, filled Hope with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. Brooke had always been perceptive, attuned to shifts in power and intention, and it was entirely possible she had sensed the tightening net around her long before the accident occurred. As suspicion deepened, so too did the emotional stakes. The potential involvement of Bill Spencer transformed the tragedy from a personal loss into a moral crisis that threatened to engulf multiple lives. If true, it would mean that ambition had crossed an irreversible line, that the pursuit of dominance within the Logan Empire had escalated into violence. It would mean that Katie's ascent, whether she was aware of it or not, had been paved with blood. Hope grappled with the implications, careful not to conflate suspicion with certainty, but unwilling to shy away from the questions that demanded answers. The investigation, both official and personal, moved forward under the shadow of doubt. Ridge oscillated between despair and resolve, his love for Brooke now intertwined with a need to protect her legacy from being manipulated or erased. Hope stood at the center of the storm, her grief transformed into clarity, her suspicions sharpened by intelligence rather than rage. She understood that the truth, once uncovered, would change everything: relationships, reputations, and the future of the Logan name itself. Brooke's death was no longer just a tragedy, it was a catalyst. It exposed fault lines long hidden beneath polished surfaces and carefully maintained alliances. Whether Bill Spencer had played a direct role or merely stood too close to the machinery that made such a crime possible remained to be proven. But one thing was certain: Brooke Logan's story did not end on that road. It continued in the questions she left behind, in the courage of a daughter unwilling to accept silence, and in the unraveling of a power structure that may have believed itself untouchable. And as Hope pressed forward, piecing together the fragments of her mother's final days, she understood that the greatest danger was not uncovering the truth, but what that truth would demand once it could no longer be ignored. As Hope pushed deeper into the unanswered spaces surrounding her mother's death, Grief slowly transformed into something sharper and more dangerous. The initial numbness that had followed Brooke's passing gave way to a relentless need for coherence. An insistence that events as violent and final as her mother's death could not exist in isolation. Every instinct Hope possessed told her that truth rarely announced itself loudly. It hid in margins, timestamps, and moments others dismissed as insignificant. And it was in one such margin, a fragment of overlooked surveillance footage, that the shape of the tragedy began to shift from suspicion into something approaching inevitability. The discovery came quietly, almost anticlimactically, as so many devastating truths do. A security camera outside a nearly empty cafe, tucked away from the usual flow of traffic, captured a brief meeting that neither Bill nor Katie had publicly acknowledged. The footage showed them arriving separately, their timing precise enough to suggest coordination rather than coincidence. They did not linger long, nor did they engage in any overtly dramatic behavior. That was what made the image so unsettling. There was no argument, no visible tension, no obvious secrecy. Instead, there was restraint, calculation, and the unmistakable posture of two people who understood the importance of not being seen together. The timestamp placed the meeting just hours before Brooke's fatal accident. For Hope, the footage felt like a physical blow. It did not prove guilt in any legal sense, but it reframed everything. Bill and Katie had not simply been connected to Brooke through history or rivalry. They had been actively coordinating at a critical moment. The choice of location, the deliberate distance from crowded spaces, and the timing all suggested urgency. This was not a casual conversation between former spouses or business partners. It was a meeting that required discretion, one conducted under the assumption that privacy equaled safety. Hope replayed the footage repeatedly, scrutinizing body language, gestures, the subtle lean in that spoke of seriousness rather than sentiment. The image etched itself into her mind, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever Bill and Katie were discussing, they did not want Brooke to know. Yet Brooke, it seemed, had known something was wrong. The recovery of Brooke's phone from the wreckage marked another turning point. One that shifted Hope's investigation from circumstantial inference to something far more personal and haunting. The device had been damaged, its screen cracked, its internal systems compromised, but technicians managed to retrieve fragments of stored data. Among them was a message draft addressed to Ridge, one that had never been sent. The incomplete text carried a weight disproportionate to its length, each word loaded with urgency and alarm. Brooke had written that she had just uncovered a devastating secret involving Logan Fashion, one that directly implicated Bill and Katie. The message ended abruptly, cut off mid-thought, mid-warning, as though time itself had intervened before she could finish. Hope stared at the fragment long after she had read it, her breath shallow, her hands cold. The unfinished message felt like a voice reaching out from the past, desperate to be heard, thwarted by violence before it could complete its purpose. Brooke had not been speculating or venting. She had been informing Ridge of something she believed required immediate attention. The phrase Logan Fashion stood out like a flare, signaling that this was not merely a personal betrayal or emotional conflict, but a revelation tied to power, legacy, and control. Whatever Brooke had discovered, it had been significant enough to warrant secrecy and urgency, yet dangerous enough to silence her before she could fully articulate it. The implications were impossible to ignore. Brooke had learned something that threatened the balance of power within the Logan empire. Something that involved both Bill and Katie, and she had been preparing to act on that knowledge. The proximity of that discovery to her death could not be dismissed as coincidence. Hope felt a cold clarity settle over her as she began to understand the shape of the narrative, taking form beneath the surface. This was not a random tragedy, nor even a crime born purely of passion. It was a calculated removal, a strategic erasure designed to eliminate an obstacle at a critical juncture. As Hope pieced together the timeline, the pattern sharpened. The secret meeting between Bill and Katie suggested coordination. The sabotaged breaks pointed to premeditation. The unfinished message indicated awareness and intent on Brooke's part. Each element reinforced the others, forming a structure too coherent to be accidental. Hope began to see her mother not as a victim caught unaware, but as someone who had recognized the threat and attempted to confront it, only to be overtaken by forces willing to go further than she had anticipated. The emotional toll of this realization was profound. Hope's grief deepened, no longer softened by nostalgia or memory, but hardened by the knowledge that Brooke's final days may have been spent under the shadow of betrayal. The thought that her mother had been navigating danger alone, weighing the consequences of exposing a truth that could dismantle everything she had built, filled Hope with a mixture of sorrow and fury. Brooke had dedicated her life to the Logan name, to the ideals of creativity, integrity, and resilience that defined it. To imagine that same legacy being weaponized against her was almost unbearable. Ridge, when presented with the evidence, struggled to reconcile the image of the woman he loved with the implications of what she had uncovered. The incomplete message haunted him, its sudden end echoing in his mind as a question he could not escape. Brooke had been trying to warn him. The knowledge intensified his grief, transforming it into a volatile blend of guilt and rage. He wondered whether he might have been able to stop her from driving that day. Whether a single moment of intervention could have altered the course of events. The sense of helplessness gnawed at him, compounded by the growing awareness that the threat Brooke faced had not been abstract, but immediate and lethal. Hope, however, refused to let emotion derail her pursuit of truth. She understood that suspicion alone was insufficient, that clarity required discipline as much as intuition. Yet she also recognized that motive was as critical as method. Bill Spencer had always been a man comfortable operating in shadows, using influence and leverage to shape outcomes in his favor. Katie, for all her outward composure, had long lived in Brooke's shadow within both family and business. The idea that the two could align, not out of affection but out of shared ambition, was not implausible. If Brooke's discovery threatened to expose a scheme capable of redefining control over Logan Fashion, then removing her would serve not just as protection, but as advancement. The cafe footage took on new significance in this context. Hope began to see it not as a meeting to plan Brooke's removal, but as a moment of consolidation, where decisions already in motion were affirmed. The restraint visible in their interaction suggested confidence, the kind that comes from believing a plan is already secure. That confidence, Hope realized, might have been misplaced. Brooke's unfinished message represented a variable they had not accounted for, a risk that had to be neutralized quickly. The timing of the accident suggested urgency rather than long-term strategy, as though Brooke's awareness had accelerated events beyond their original timeline. Hope also considered the possibility that Katie herself may not have anticipated the full consequences of their actions. Ambition, when aligned with fear, often leads people to underestimate the moral cost of success. It was possible that Katie had believed the situation would resolve itself without irreversible harm, that Bill's assurances had blurred the line between manipulation and inevitability. Yet the evidence did not absolve her. Presence implied complicity, and silence implied consent. Whether driven by desire for control, resentment, or desperation to secure her position, Katie's involvement in the secret meeting placed her squarely within the circle of suspicion. As Hope delved deeper into financial records, internal communications, and the recent strategic shifts within Logan Fashion, the contours of the secret Brooke had uncovered began to emerge. There were signs of restructuring that had not been formally disclosed, decisions made without Brooke's approval, and financial maneuvers that suggested an impending transfer of influence. The idea that Bill, operating through intermediaries, could be positioning Katie as a central authority within the brand was not merely speculative. It aligned with patterns Hope recognized from years of observing how power was quietly reassigned. Long before it was publicly announced, the realization that her mother had been standing in the way of a carefully engineered transformation filled Hope with grim admiration. Brooke had always been perceptive, unwilling to relinquish control without understanding the consequences. If she had uncovered evidence of manipulation or betrayal within Logan Fashion, she would not have ignored it. She would have confronted it, documented it, and prepared to expose it. That determination, Hope now believed, may have sealed her fate. The unfinished message became a symbol of that determination, a final act of resistance interrupted by violence. Hope returned to it again and again, reading the words as though they might expand with repetition, reveal more than they contained. The abrupt ending felt like a scream cut short, a truth silenced before it could fully form. It strengthened Hope's resolve, transforming her investigation from a search for answers into a moral obligation. Brooke had been denied the chance to speak. Hope would speak for her. The growing body of evidence placed Hope in an increasingly precarious position. She understood that pursuing this line of inquiry would not merely uncover wrongdoing, but challenge powerful individuals with much to lose. The same forces capable of silencing Brooke might not hesitate to protect themselves again. Yet fear no longer held the same power over Hope. Grief had stripped away hesitation, leaving behind clarity and purpose. She was no longer investigating for closure alone, but for justice and perhaps for prevention. As the pieces aligned, Hope recognized that the truth, once revealed, would reverberate far beyond her family. It would shake the foundations of Logan Fashion, redefine alliances, and expose the cost of ambition unchecked by conscience. Whether Bill and Katie had acted out of calculation, desperation, or belief in their own inevitability, the consequences were now unavoidable. Brooke's death had set something irreversible in motion, And the unfinished message she left behind ensured that silence would not be the final chapter of her story. Hope stood at the edge of that revelation, aware that the path forward would demand courage as much as evidence. The truth, once uncovered, would not restore what had been lost, but it would honor the woman who had refused to be erased quietly. Brooke Logan's voice, interrupted on that road, would be carried forward through her daughter's resolve, and the secrets buried beneath the Logan name would no longer remain safely hidden.